All right, so you guys really want to dive into this whole education battleground, huh? Seems like everyone's been requesting a deep dive on former President Trump's education proposal, so let's get into it. He's certainly got people talking, that's for sure,
Yeah, no doubt about that. There's a lot to unpack here.
to say the least, right?
I mean, at first glance, it kind of seems like he's sending these, mixed messages.
How so?
Well, he's talking about wanting to downsize the Department of Education, but then at the same time, he wants to get really specific about what's actually being taught in classrooms.
It's a head scratcher for sure. Less federal oversight, but more control over what's actually in the curriculum. How does that even work?
Exactly. It's like pick a lane. And then, of course, there's the big elephant in the room, his proposal to slash education spending, in half.
Whoa, okay, so where's all that money going then? And what would that even mean for, everyday schools?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting and where context is super important. While Trump is proposing some pretty major cuts, we got to remember that federal funding only makes up a small chunk of the total K-12 budget. It's about
Ah,
10%.
okay.
So if these cuts actually happened, states would be left holding the bag and facing some really, really tough choices.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. What kind of choices are we talking about here?
Think about it. They'd be dealing with these huge cuts to budgets that are already stretched super thin. We could be talking teacher layoffs, bigger class sizes, maybe even cutting back on important stuff like arts or sports.
Oh, wow.
It's like a domino effect that could seriously impact the quality of education for pretty much everyone.
Yeah, that's a big deal. And then on top of all of that, he wants to create this curriculum police force to, scrutinize textbooks and lesson plans for anything considered woke. Isn't that
Yeah.
kind of a logistical
Yeah.
nightmare, especially with how many schools there are in the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about policing almost 100,000 public schools. It's a massive undertaking. And it immediately makes you think of all those past controversies about censorship in education, like trying to ban certain books from
Oh,
libraries.
right, yeah.
This whole curriculum police force idea brings up some really important questions about whether it's even doable, potential bias, and if it might end up stifling different viewpoints in the classroom.
You mentioned censorship, and it's interesting because this proposal seems directly tied to that whole debate sparked by Trump's 1776 commission, right?
Exactly. Now, for those who might not remember, the 1776 Commission was created during Trump's presidency, and it was all about promoting what they called a patriotic education. But a lot of critics saw it as whitewashing history and just fueling the education culture wars we're seeing play out even more now.
So basically, it feeds into this much bigger and honestly pretty heated debate about what should actually be taught in schools and who
Yeah,
gets to make that call, right?
100%.
Okay, so how do we define woke content in this context? Like, what does that even mean in practice?
Well, woke, at least in this context, is often used to describe things like ideas or materials about systemic racism, social justice, LGBTQ plus rights. Basically, anything that makes certain groups uncomfortable.
Right.
People who support these reviews say it's about stopping students from being taught one specific ideology.
Okay.
But then you have opponents who say it's just a sneaky way to shut down important conversations about identity and inequality.
So it's like this fundamental disagreement on what counts as indoctrination versus what's just necessary learning about the world.
Exactly. It's almost impossible to define because the term woke is so subjective. What one person considers woke might be another person's historical accuracy or just a reflection of how diverse our society really is.
Yeah.
It's this vagueness that makes this whole proposal so controversial.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on Trump's vision for education, which seems to be all about giving more power to states and parents. But what about Vice President Harris? The article mentioned she's been pretty vocal about criticizing Trump's plans, but we haven't heard as much about her own vision for education. What's her take on all of this?
You're right. She's been pretty quiet on the specifics. I mean, she's a big supporter of public schools, that's for sure. And she's talked about how important early childhood education is. But she hasn't really laid out a detailed plan yet.
So she's all about early childhood education, but what does that actually look like? I mean, what kind of policies would she put in place to make high-quality pre-K available for more families?
That's the million-dollar question, right? She could maybe look at programs that are already working, like universal pre-K in some states. We might see some proposals for more federal funding to help more kids get access to pre-K, maybe support for training teachers in early childhood development, or even incentives for public-private partnerships to make it more affordable for families.
Yeah, those are some good ideas. And what about her stance on student loan forgiveness? The article mentioned she's in favor of continuing what the Biden administration's been doing, but how far would she go with it?
This is where things get interesting. The article mentions she's been kind of vague on the details, but if you look at her past, it seems like she might be open to doing more. Like, remember that bill Bernie Sanders proposed back in 2017 to make tuition free at public colleges and
Yeah.
universities? She co-sponsored that, so who knows, maybe she'd be up for something similar when it comes to student debt. It's hard to say for sure.
So it's like we have some clues based on what she supported in the past, but we're still waiting on the concrete details. It seems like both candidates are leaving us with more questions than answers. It's like trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. How are voters supposed to make sense of all this when they're deciding who to vote for?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of the issue. This election isn't just about picking a president. It's about deciding what we want the future of education to look like in this country. Do we want to give more control to individual states and parents, even if it means some kids might not get the same quality of education as others? Or do we think the federal government needs to step in and make sure everyone has access to a good education, no matter where they live?
Right. It's about finding that balance between a one-size-fits-all approach and giving states the freedom to do their own thing. There are good arguments on both sides, which can make it really tough for voters.
Exactly. And it seems like Trump's vision leans more towards letting states and parents call the shots, even if it means you end up with a bunch of different approaches to education across the country.
And what about Harris? Where does she stand on that?
Well, based on what she's said and done in the past, it seems like she thinks the federal government should be more involved in setting standards, making sure things are fair for everyone, and giving all students access to a quality education no matter what zip code they live in. But without those specific proposals, it's really hard to say for sure what impact her vision would have.
So we've got these two very different paths for education, but it sounds like, especially with Harris, the specifics are still kind of fuzzy. What does all of this actually mean for the people listening? How do we cut through all the campaign talk and figure out what really matters when it comes to something as important as education?
It really boils down to this. This election isn't just about checking a box for president. It's about deciding what we want the future of education to look like, for our kids, for the country.
Right.
Do we say, let's give more control to the states, let parents have more say, even if it means some schools end up with more resources, some kids get a better shot than others? Or do we say, no, the federal government needs to be more hands-on, make sure things are fair, everyone has a chance? It's a big question.
It's huge, and you've given us so much to think about.
It's complicated, no doubt.
It seems like we need to look beyond just the surface level, really understand those policy details when we're making our choices.
I think that's key. And it goes even deeper than just budgets and what's being taught, right? It's about the whole philosophy behind education. You listen to Trump and Harris, they're tapping into some really deep beliefs about what education should even be, what it's for.
It's like they're both making the same dish, but with totally different ingredients.
Yeah.
Both might sound good in theory, but the proof is in the pudding, right?
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, it's not enough to just read the menu. We got to look at the recipe, see what they're actually putting in there. What are the trade-offs? What matters most to us? Only then can we decide which one we think will turn out better, for everyone.
So it's more than just disagreeing on policy. It's like two different universes of thought when it comes to education.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Is it about just knowing stuff? Is it about getting a good job? Or is it about creating good citizens, well-rounded people? The answer to that might be the deciding factor in who you support, what resonates with you.
Wow, that's something to chew on as we head into this election. Thanks for breaking it all down with us.
My pleasure. This is a conversation that's so important to have, and I'm glad we could dig into it.